In a world where fighters scream for attention and build brands louder than their punches, Fedor Emelianenko did the opposite. No callouts, no insults, no drama, just silence and violence. From 2000 to 2010, he wasn't just undefeated, he was untouchable. A calm-faced Russian storm who dismantled legends without ever raising his voice. Mirko Cro Cop, Big Nog Coleman, Randleman, all fell before the last emperor. But what happens when the man who never sought the spotlight suddenly loses his crown? No excuses, no comeback tour, just a quiet step into the shadows. This is the haunting story of Fedor, a man who ruled MMA not with hype but with mystery. And when he fell, he didn't crash, he simply vanished. But his myth, it never left, because sometimes the scariest fighter is the one who says nothing at all. Before we start, subscribe the channel to support our growth. Thank you. Fedor Emelianenko didn't walk into the sport of MMA with fireworks or fanfare. He entered like a shadow moving through snow, quiet, controlled, unshakably calm. And from the very beginning, that silence was unsettling, because what followed it was always violent. Born on September 28, 1976, in the small industrial town of Rubizhin in the Soviet Union, Fedor's early life was shaped by struggle. His family moved to Stary Oskol, a steel city where the winters were harsh, and survival meant discipline. His father was a welder, his mother a school teacher. They didn't have much, but they had structure, and structure became his foundation. He began training in judo and sambo at a young age, eventually earning the rank of International Master of Sport. By the time he finished his mandatory military service in the Russian army, he had forged a mind of steel and a body built for war. But what separated Fedor from others wasn't just talent, it was his demeanor. No emotion, no flair, just task and execution. In 2000, he entered the world of professional MMA. He wasn't fighting for money or fame, he was fighting because it was what he was made for. His early fights in the Japanese Rings promotion showed flashes of his unique ability to blend sambo with striking, but it was more than technique. It was presence. Fedor moved like a middleweight, explosive, agile, reactive, but he hit like a truck. And despite his size, he rarely relied on brute force. His success came from understanding angles, timing, and pressure. He stayed calm while others panicked. He closed distance when others backed up. He found clarity in chaos. That unnerved people, commentators and opponents alike, would later describe it as coldness, like he was operating on a different frequency. In those early days, he wasn't trash-talking, he wasn't marketing, he wasn't even smiling. He was calculating. By the time he entered Pride in 2002, Fedor had built a 10-1 record with quiet precision. His only loss came via doctor stoppage due to a cut, and he would avenge that, not with words, but with obliteration. As the sport evolved, fighters began realizing something about Fedor. He wasn't just winning fights, he was removing hope. Opponents would land punches, throws, even takedowns, but it never rattled him. He got back up, he pressed forward, and then he ended it. In 2002, Fedor Emelianenko entered the gates of Pride Fighting Championships, a coliseum built for legends. It wasn't just Japan's premier MMA organization, it was the stage where icons were made. The walkouts were grand, the crowds were massive, the stakes? Biblical. Fedor didn't flinch. In his Pride debut, he faced Semi Schilt, a Dutch giant standing nearly 7 feet tall. Schilt had a terrifying resume in kickboxing, but Fedor dismantled him with brutal efficiency. Takedowns, top control, ground and pound. Schilt had no answers. Then came Heath Herring, a rising star. Fedor destroyed him, opening a gash so severe the fight was stopped. People began to take notice. This quiet Russian wasn't just winning, he was dominating. But it was his 2003 fight against Antonio Rodrigo Minotauro Nogueira that changed everything. Big Nog was the Pride heavyweight champion, a submission wizard with legendary toughness. Fedor was the underdog. Pundits predicted that the Russian wouldn't survive Nogueira's guard, but they were wrong. For 3 rounds, Fedor beat Nogueira like no one ever had. He slammed him, he passed guard, he dropped punches with surgical violence. The jiu-jitsu phenom couldn't find a moment to breathe. Fedor walked through his defense like a ghost through walls. He became Pride's heavyweight king that night. What followed was an unprecedented run of destruction. Fedor defended his title against every name they threw at him. Mark Coleman, the godfather of ground and pound, submitted. Kevin Randleman slammed Fedor on his neck with a suplex from hell, only to get armbarred moments later. Mirko Cro Cop, the most feared striker in MMA at the time. The bout was billed as the ultimate test, and it delivered. Fedor walked through fire, absorbing Cro Cop's deadly kicks, and returned fire with with jabs, takedowns, and pressure. He outlasted the storm and proved he could not only survive violence, he could master it. He didn't just defeat legend, he made them look human. What made Fedor so unique in Pride wasn't just his skill, it was his demeanor. No victory dance, no post-fight monologue. He'd win, bow, and walk away. In an age of ego, he was all essence. Between 2000 and 2010, Fedor Emelianenko compiled one of the greatest undefeated streaks in MMA history. For an entire decade, he didn't lose a single fight. 28 wins, 20 finishes, 0 quit. His dominance became surreal. He didn't just beat the best, he finished them in their prime. Mark Hunt, Tim Sylvia, Andrei Arlovsky, all elite, all humbled. By this point, Fedor wasn't a man, he was a force. Opponents entered the ring with game plans. They left it broken. What they didn't understand was that Fedor never followed a script. He would explode with a 3-punch combo, clinch with a judo toss, then finish with brutal ground and pound, all in under a minute. He wasn't predictable, he was inevitable. But behind the monster was still the monk. He trained in modest gyms, slept in bunk beds during camp, ate plain food, refused luxury. Where other fighters paraded Lamborghinis, Fedor wore the same warm-up suit from Russia, always silent, always composed. The fans called him the last emperor, and the title fit. He carried himself like a monarch from an ancient time, stoic, regal, untouched by the chaos around him. The more the sport grew noisy with promotions, trash talk, and politics, the more people respected his refusal to play the game. But even as the wins piled up, Fedor began to sense a shift. Pride was crumbling under scandal. The UFC was rising in the West. Dana White made public offers. Superfights were on the table. Fedor didn't bite. He demanded co-promotion, creative freedom, and respect. The UFC refused. The fans were robbed of matchups with Brock Lesnar, Randy Couture, and more. Critics blamed Fedor, but those close to him knew Fedor never fought for legacy. He fought for principle, and still, he kept winning. But nothing lasts forever. Not in war, not in life. And deep inside, Fedor knew what came next. By 2007, Fedor Emelianenko was still undefeated, still feared, and still untouchable in the eyes of the public. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to fracture. Not inside the cage, but around it. Pride, the legendary Japanese organization where Fedor built his myth, was crumbling. Financial issues, scandal, and an eventual buyout by the UFC left dozens of fighters without a home. And while many made the leap to the octagon, Fedor didn't. Not because he didn't want to fight there, but because negotiations fell apart. Fedor's management at M1 Global demanded co-promotion, more money, and creative control. Dana White refused. Talks stalled. And the fight the world wanted, Fedor versus Randy Couture, Fedor versus Brock Lesnar, never happened. That was the first crack. The idea that Fedor was avoiding competition. To the fans who'd watched him destroy giants, this sounded ridiculous. But to the UFC faithful, it became an opening. Fedor never fought the best, they said. He ducked the octagon. Fedor didn't respond. He never did. Instead, he signed with Affliction, a new American promotion backed by big money and big dreams. His debut was thunderous. He obliterated Tim Sylvia in 36 seconds. He followed it by flatlining Andrei Arlovsky with a single right hand. Still, questions remain. Sylvia and Arlovsky were past their prime. Were these real wins or just reminders? Then came 2010. Strikeforce, Fabrizio Werdum. This wasn't supposed to be a challenge. Werdum was respected, sure, a grappler, a veteran. But this was Fedor, the emperor, the unbeatable. The fight lasted just over a minute. Fedor came out aggressive, dropped Werdum to the mat. It looked like another easy night. But then, a triangle, a trap. Werdum baited him into ground control and locked the choke. And just like that, after 10 years, the emperor tapped. No excuses, no tantrum, no drama, just a nod. "I thank God for this loss," Fedor said through a translator. But for fans, it was surreal. The invincible man had broken. In the aftermath of the Werdum loss, most fighters would regroup, revise their training, find new coaches, reignite the fire. But Fedor wasn't most fighters. He didn't believe in changing what had worked for a decade. He didn't jump camps. He didn't chase evolution. He simply returned to Russia, prayed, and waited for the next war. The next one came fast. Antonio Bigfoot Silva, a mountain of a man, 6'4", 285 pounds. Not technical, not fast, but relentless. Fedor walked into the Strikeforce cage like always, calm, stoic, seemingly unfazed. And for the first 5 minutes, it worked. He danced around Bigfoot, landing shots, staying mobile. Then, in round 2, it changed. Silva got the takedown, and for the next 5 minutes, it was punishment. Bigfoot mounted Fedor, rained down hammer fists, elbows, and smothering pressure. The smaller man underneath couldn't move. The bell saved him from a finish, but not from the damage. When the doctor checked his face between rounds, one eye was completely shut. Fight stopped. Loss number 2. And yet, still, no complaint, no meltdown, just a bow of the head and a soft statement. God's will. Then came Dan Henderson, a man smaller than Fedor, but a former Olympic wrestler with nuclear power in both hands. This was the comeback fight, the rebound. But in round 1, after rocking Henderson, Fedor charged in reckless, got clipped by a sneaky uppercut, and crumpled. Third straight loss. 3 legends, 3 wars, 3 falls. It wasn't just a decline, it was a collapse. And the MMA world, cruel as ever, turned. Was he ever that good? Maybe it was all hype. Never fought in the UFC, never fought Kane, JDS, or Stipe. Suddenly, the myth was melting. The last emperor had become just another aging fighter. And yet, in every post-fight press conference, Fedor wore the same expression. Peaceful, humble, no excuses, no blame, only acceptance. Because for him, the fights were never about the show. They were about purpose. After the Henderson fight, Fedor Emelianenko did what most didn't expect. He disappeared. Not into the media, not into commentary, not into coaching, into stillness. He returned to Stary Oskol, the small industrial town where he was born, trained quietly, spent time with family, attended Orthodox church, grew his beard, vanished from the noise. For a time, there were whispers. He's retired. He's gone for good. He's lost the fire. And maybe he had, but he never said it. There was no press release, no grand farewell tour, no final fight at Madison Square Garden, just absence. It suited him. While other retired fighters chased TV gigs, book deals, or podcast platforms, Fedor remained silent. When asked about legacy, he said, "Only God can judge." When asked about the UFC, he smiled and said, "It wasn't for me." There were no viral quotes, no interviews to stoke controversy. And slowly, the sport began to move on. Cain Velasquez became the new king, then Stipe Miocic, then the next wave. And yet, every few months, Fedor's name still surfaced. Could he beat Lesnar? What if he'd signed with the UFC? Is he the greatest heavyweight of all time? Because while he may have stepped away, his shadow never did. The mystique remained. And that mystique, his silence, his coldness, his spiritual calm, wasn't accidental. It was armor. It kept him separate from the circus. It made him timeless. But even silence can't hold forever. By 2015, after 4 years away, the whispers became confirmation. Fedor was coming back. Older, slower, still dangerous. In 2015, after nearly 4 years of silence, Fedor Emelianenko announced he was returning to MMA. But this wasn't the same Fedor. He was now 39, slower, broader in the shoulders, the lines on his face deeper, the beard thicker, but the eyes still the same, unreadable, focused, distant. His comeback fight came under Japan's Risen banner, a spiritual successor to Pride. And the opponent? Singh Jaideep, a kickboxer with little MMA pedigree. The match was more ceremonial than competitive, and that's what worried people. Fedor dismantled Jaideep in 2 minutes, but the celebration felt hollow. The question wasn't whether he could win, it was who he was fighting and why. Still, he pressed on. He beat Fabio Maldonado in a bloody war that exposed his age, his reflexes, and his vulnerability. The judges gave him the win. The world called it a robbery. Fedor, true to form, said nothing. Then came Bellator. In 2017, Scott Coker signed The Last Emperor to his heavyweight division. It felt like a farewell tour, not a final chapter, but the slow turning of the final pages. The fights were bigger now, the opponents tougher. He faced Matt Mitrione, a former NFL player turned knockout artist. And in one of the most bizarre moments in MMA history, both men knocked each other down with simultaneous punches. But Mitrione got up faster. Fedor didn't. Still, he fought on. He knocked out Frank Mir in less than a minute, dropped Chael Sonnen in a chaotic ground and pound flurry, and reached the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix final at 42 years old. But then, in 2019, reality returned. Ryan Bader, younger, faster, sharper, blitzed Fedor in 35 seconds. A left hook, lights out, another loss, another reminder. And yet, even then, Fedor didn't make excuses. He bowed, he thanked the crowd, he whispered his goodbyes. But still, no final announcement. Because for him, it was never about legacy points or belts. It was about the act itself, the ritual, the war. Fedor Emelianenko could have walked away after Bader. No one would have blamed him. He was in his 40s, a Hall of Famer, a global icon. His silence had earned him respect. His legacy was sealed. But Fedor had one more war to fight, one final walk. In 2023, Bellator announced what would be Fedor's last fight. The opponent? Again, Ryan Bader, the man who had stopped him 4 years earlier. This time, the tone was different. Not vengeance, not hype. Ceremony. The venue was packed. Legends sat cage-side. Royce Gracie, Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Dan Henderson. Fighters who had built the sport Fedor helped shape. They were all there to witness the final chapter. Fedor walked out to the same stoic music music, same expressionless face, but there was a weight behind his steps, the kind that only comes when you know this is it. The fight didn't last long. Fedor was faster, younger, sharper. The punches landed early, and within 2 minutes, Fedor was on the mat, not twitching, not violently KO'd, just done, calm, as if even his body knew there was nothing left to prove. When the referee waved it off, Fedor didn't protest. He stood, wiped his gloves, bowed his head, the cage filled with legends who embraced him. Fedor, respectful as ever, raised his hand and then stepped aside, because this wasn't his moment. It was Fedor's. He took off his gloves, placed them in the center of the cage, said thank you to the crowd in Russian, and that was it. No crying, no theatrics, no victory speech, just grace. For 2 decades he had fought monsters, survived wars, lost, won, aged, and endured, and now he walked away. Finally, now that it's over, now that the gloves are laid down, the ring lights dimmed, and the chants quieted, what's left of Fedor Emelianenko? Is he the greatest heavyweight of all time? To some, yes. To others, he's a relic from an untested era. But to everyone who saw him, he was something we may never see again. Fedor was never about perfect technique, never about showmanship. He didn't sell fights. He didn't talk trash. He didn't manipulate media narratives. He just showed up and destroyed you. His legend doesn't come from an undefeated record. It comes from the way he made you feel. The quiet before the storm. The calm walkouts. The moment you realized he was hitting harder than physics should allow. And above all, the fact that he never needed to scream to be heard. He ruled pride. He rejected the UFC. He never apologized for being himself. He remained loyal to his faith, his team, his family, even when it cost him millions, even when it meant fading quietly while louder fighters stole the spotlight. But in the long game of legacy, noise fades and substance remains. Fedor Emelianenko remains the blueprint for the warrior who fights not for attention, but for honor, the monk who knew violence, the soldier who didn't flinch, the myth who became real and somehow stayed mythical. He inspired generations of fighters, Khabib, Islam Makhachev, and many others who saw in him what no one else had, the balance of brutality and humility. He didn't change MMA with words. He changed it with silence, with presence, with consequence. And as his story closes, he leaves behind not just a resume, but a warning that the greatest fighters aren't always the loudest or even the most decorated. Sometimes they're the ones who bow their heads, speak softly, and leave behind silence that echoes forever.